Friends, I am a flawed human being. I am a flawed human being. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. Those are Paul's words read just a few moments ago, but they are my words as well. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. My name is Will Reed. I'm one of the pastors here at the church, and we are continuing our series, our worship sermon series, For the Common Good. You may remember that phrase, for the common good, came from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, where Paul says these words, "To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." As we begin the series, we talked about how God gives each of us gifts that are unique to us and are to be used for the common good. 2 weeks ago, Maria talked about how we use those gifts to their fullest when we use them together as a part of the body of Christ. And when we use them together, the body of Christ is complete and good things can happen. Then last week we talked about God's gift of love. In the last verse of chapter 12, Paul talked about how there is something that is coming that is more complete, and that is the gift of love. The gift of love. By the way, I gave you a couple of assignments last week. One of them was to serve as assistant section leaders, but the other was to do some random acts of kindness. Anybody do some random acts of kindness this week? Hey, good. I'm glad to hear that. I look forward to finding out how some of that went with you and how what it was like for you. So last week we talked about the gift of love, but today we talk about God's gift of grace. God's gift of grace. God's gift of unmerited forgiveness, unmerited love. God's gift of grace. But before we kind of get into that, I have to share with you something that I found this week. It's kind of it's hard to see from there, but if maybe you can see it. It is the wrapper from a piece of Dove chocolate. Okay? Some of you may know that I keep a bowl of chocolate in my office. The stated reason for that is because I want the people who are guests in my office to have a little something sweet to chew on every now and then. But the reality is, I like chocolate. And I probably eat more of the chocolate than anybody else. And so recently I filled it up with some Dove chocolate, some dark chocolate, which is frankly the best of the options. But you may not know this, but if you're a chocolate eater, you probably do know this. But on the inside of the wrapper for Dove chocolates, there is always a little saying. It's kind of like picking up a fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant. But this week, when I picked up one of these, I got this word: things have to fall apart for them to fall together. Things have to fall apart for them to fall together. And I got to thinking about that and realized that there's really a gospel message in that saying. Dove chocolate probably didn't intend that as a gospel message, but to some extent there is a gospel message in that saying. Things have to fall apart for things to fall together. So if you think about our journey as followers of Jesus Christ, oftentimes things have to fall apart before we get to a point where we understand that it is only by the grace of God that things can come together. Things have to fall apart before they fall together. By the grace of God, God gives us the opportunity for for things to come together. But so oftentimes, the reason things fall apart are our own doing. I mean, we put ourselves first. We think about only ourselves. We do things that are meant to advance our own understanding of what it means to be a success in the world. And in the process, we do things that are hurtful to others. We do things that separate us from God and from others. And in the process, eventually, things fall apart. And it is only when things fall apart that God begins to work on us and we begin to have an understanding that the only way that we are going to turn things around is but by the grace of God. By the grace of God, things will begin to turn around as we begin to become followers of Jesus Christ. The choices and decisions that we make as human beings can only sometimes be redeemed by the grace of God. Sometimes we have this revelation that what we have done can only be redeemed by God. But I have to tell you, it is actually by what John Wesley would call prevenient grace that we even come to that understanding. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, talked about prevenient grace, where God is working on the inside of us, and God is working to try to incline our hearts toward God. And oftentimes we are totally unaware of how God is working within us to turn our hearts God's direction. John Wesley calls that prevenient grace. And we begin to come to that realization because we begin to realize that the choices that we have made are not the best, that success and achievement in the world's eyes are not really always the best way to go. I'm always amazed when I hear somebody say that so-and-so pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. You ever heard that phrase? That phrase, I used to think highly of someone who would use that phrase, oh, so-and-so pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. But the reality is when I hear that phrase, I realize that we are not acknowledging the gifts that God has given us and the ways that God has intervened in our lives that give us the grace to be who we are, that give us the opportunity to be the fullness of who God calls us to be. It is not by our own doing. Yes, we may participate, but it is when we recognize who we really are and the things that we have really done, the things that we have done to separate ourselves from others, that give us the opportunity to turn things around sometimes and to be successful, whatever that means to you. The only way that we can turn things around is to admit to ourselves and to admit to God that we have fallen short, that we have not done the things that we have been called to do, that we have been hurtful to others, that we have separated ourselves from God and from others. And it's only by God's grace and God's love and God's forgiveness that we are whole again. And I don't know if you caught this in reading the Old Testament lesson and reading the lesson from 1 Corinthians and reading the gospel lesson. This is exactly what happened with Isaiah and with the Apostle Paul and also with Simon Peter. Simon Peter and Paul and Isaiah all came to the realization that they had separated themselves from God, that they had done things that made it difficult for them to be whole. Isaiah in the Old Testament, we read the story, the Old Testament lesson, and it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. And then further down in the text, Isaiah says to God, woe is me, I am lost, For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And it is when Isaiah comes clean and admits to God who he is and what he has done, it is in that moment that it says, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. And then Isaiah says, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for me? And I said, here I am, send me. It is only when Isaiah came clean and began to began to open himself up to God, that God was able to say to him, whom shall I send? And Isaiah says, send me. And then we read the story of Paul in 1 Corinthians, and the story of Paul is a fascinating story because, you see, Paul was one of the chief persecutors of Christians in the early church. In the book of Acts, in chapter 7 and chapter 8, we read all the things that Paul did. In fact, Paul was one of the ones who was present there at the stoning of Stephen, a young leader in the Christian church. And in chapter 8, verse 1, it says, and Saul, later to be named Paul, approved of their killing of Stephen. It says, that day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentations over them. But Saul, later named Paul, was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off men and women and committing them to prison. This is who Paul was. He was one who persecuted the early church, and he thought that he was doing the right thing. He was a good and devout Jew, and he was trying to protect the Jewish faith, but he was persecuting the early church. And what does Paul say? He says, for I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me has not been in vain. And then there's the gospel lesson, another story, a story of a guy named Simon, a fisherman. Simon and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, had been out fishing all night, casting their nets in the Sea of Galilee, in our gospel lesson referred to as the Lake of Gennesaret. They're the same thing. And they are out there all night, and they have not caught anything. They've not caught anything. And they come back, and surely they are absolutely exhausted, having been all night casting their nets and not catching anything. And they're cleaning their nets, and they're putting their boats up. And then this guy that they have not seen before walks up and starts talking to the people who are gathered there along the Sea of Galilee. And then Jesus gets into Simon's boat. I mean, that'd be like somebody getting in your car and you know, hanging their head out the window and starting talking to everybody. And Jesus says to Simon, put your boat out a little ways. And can you imagine what that must be like? And so Simon does what he's told. He puts the boat out a little ways. And Jesus talks, and then Jesus says, let's go fishing. Let's go fishing. Simon says, we've been out all night. We didn't catch anything. But Jesus says, come on, let's go fishing. And so they go out, and Simon and James and John, they do what Jesus says. And they put their nets down. Jesus tells them to put their nets down in the deep water. Take a risk, go out in the deep water and put your nets down in the deep water. And when they do and they put their nets down, they fill their nets with fish, so many fish that it's almost that the boats are about to sink. I mean, they have hit the jackpot. I mean, it's almost like they won the lottery, the biggest catch they've ever had. And they come back to shore, and what does Simon say to Jesus? Simon says to Jesus, after all of this, he says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And then Jesus invites him to follow. And what does Simon do? Simon and James and John, they leave the biggest catch they have ever caught sitting there right on the seashore. You know, they're fishermen. No fish, no food, no money. They leave all of that and they follow Jesus. It would be almost like, you know, you've got a lottery ticket and you've hit the jackpot and you never cash it in. Actually, I met a guy the other day. I was in San Antonio and I met a guy that met me at the airport and he told me that he'd won a lot. He'd gotten a scratch-off lottery ticket. He won $1 million. He won $1 million. And this was a guy that was working in a little, surely not much more than minimum wage position. And he won $1 million. And he told me that his boss told him what to do and helped him kind of organize his life going forward. And so he paid cash for a house, and he put the rest of the money in savings and so that he could have some money for retirement. And he still was working that little more than minimum wage job. He cashed in the lottery ticket, but he stayed where he was. Well, Peter and James and John, they didn't cash in anything. They left all those fish right there by the seashore. And for that, on that particular day, I guess it was a lottery for everybody who was looking for something to eat because they had free fish that day. And Peter and James and John, they went and followed Jesus along the way. So here's the situation. In each of these cases, the first thing that happened, whether it's Isaiah or whether it's Paul or whether it's Simon Peter, each of them came clean with God. Each of them said to God, "God, I have messed up. I am in bad shape. I am a sinner. I am unclean." And it was in that relationship that God redeemed them. And in each case, life was totally different. In Saul's case, Saul's name was changed to Paul. In Simon's case, Simon's name was changed to Peter. And when we do the same thing, our name is changed as well. Our name from that point on is Christian, as we accept God's grace, as we acknowledge the ways in which we have separated ourselves from God and from others, as we take the challenge to go out into the deep water, to do the things that God is calling us to do that perhaps we have been putting off for a long time. Friends, God's greatest gift to all of us is the gift of God's grace. And grace is a fancy word for unmerited love, unmerited forgiveness. And that grace gives us the power and the strength to be the people that God calls us to be. And friends, God's grace is meant to be shared. It is meant to be shared. One of the things that I have really enjoyed is reading the work of of Catherine Matthews. And Catherine Matthews talks about a visit several years ago that she had with Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was in the United States to talk about her work in India. And as she was there, she told a story about how oftentimes there are people that say they want to come to India and they want to work with Mother Teresa and do the things that she was doing. You may know that Mother Teresa left everything to work with the poor in Calcutta, India. And I really like the story that what she said that Mother Teresa said in that setting. She said, "Love the people that God has given you to love. Stay here. Be who you are. Love the people God has given you to love." Friends, I think that's a message for us. As we accept God's grace, as we accept God's love, as we receive God's forgiveness, we are invited to love the people where we are, to share God's grace and God's forgiveness in the places we are. Isn't that a message for the Church of Jesus Christ? That we are called to love the people where we are. In this location, in this community, in this place, we are called to share God's love and God's grace with the people where we are. One of the greatest gifts that we have been given is God's gift of grace. It is for us individually, but it is also for us to share as God's people. And friends, we are called to share it with one another for the common good. To share it with our neighbors in the community around us, to share it with the people that we work with, to share it with the people that we go to school with. We are called to share God's grace, that others might find their lives transformed and that the world will be transformed as well. Friends, but by the grace of God, I am who I am. But by the grace of God, I am who I am. Friends, I invite you to say that with me. But by the grace of God, I am who I am. Amen.